unaccustomed as I am. This is one of the things about being on the committee. Apparently, you get to do stuff like this. Anyway, I have the great pleasure this morning of introducing Andrew Cort, all the way from Scotland. So we're very fortunate. Andrew is a retired businessman and professional engineer. From a very early age, he's had numerous spiritual and extraordinary experiences. He was originally brought up as an Anglo Catholic and was confirmed into the Anglican and Methodist churches when he was 16. In his late 40s and early 50s, his experiences became much more numerous and intense, to the point where he took early retirement and dedicated his life to being of service to others through charity work, becoming a spiritual healer, and furthering his knowledge through studying for a master's degree in Contemporary Theology at St. Andrew's University. Today, he would describe himself as an unorthodox Christian.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you.
You get this?
No, I'll go on already.
All right, excellent.
Two things, for the sake of comfort and clarity, and to make sure we can all see the screen, I'm going to do this presentation sitting, but I'm a big chap, so hopefully everybody can see me. Hopefully you can see it. Hopefully you can hear me now. Yes? Thank you. I'm going to do this presentation sitting down just for the comfort of people being able to see the screen and just follow two screens and my notes on all at the same time. First things first, if I start coughing halfway through this presentation, I apologize. I have not got COVID. I tested myself before I came. But 4 years ago, I started to develop hay fever, and it's got progressively worse as the years pass, which is a bit late, strange in middle life. Anyway, with further ado, I will continue. Just a bit about my background. Ian's already touched upon this. Being born and brought up in Lancashire, Church of England school, Methodist boarding school in the 70s, which was rather like cold. For those who remember the series, trained as a naval architect and shipbuilder, I moved to Scotland 42 years ago. This is quite a special summer for me because it's 40 years ago that I was working in the Irish shipbuilders, helping to finish a frigate. 3 months ahead of schedule to sail straight to the Falklands War. And we discovered that ships burned again, and I was in charge of fitting as much firefighting equipment to the ship as we could before she left. She came back with holes in, but stayed afloat, which is the main thing. I spent 10 years in naval design and construction, and then got bored with it. So I then moved to the oil and gas business, which is in high demand right now, as you can imagine, now for 28 years. And Ian's already touched upon this. I was born and brought up as a high Anglican, experiences through my life, and describe myself as an Orthodox Christian. What I'd like to do now is just touch upon an agenda that we're going to follow. I thought, and I'm an engineer and analyst by background, so I always want to look at defining things in their simplest terms, but at least for me to understand. And I think it's beneficial for others just to remind ourselves. So calling upon various areas, online dictionaries, etc., look at the definition of joy. And I'm also going to spend some time talking about a rather special lady, certainly in my life, because I've been studying her for the best part of the last year, which is the Anglo-Catholic mystic Evelyn Underhill, and looking at specifically what took place over a decade of her life and the formation of her spiritual development and awareness. Going to look at some famous historical mystics. Also look at an organization called IMER, which I'll explain later on, and some contemporary mystics of the last 50 years. I'm then going to look back to one of the past members of the fellowship, Dr. Robert Crookall, who did some fairly major writing in the 60s. And one particular volume of his work is the interpretation of cosmic and mystical experiences. Drawing some elements out of that, give some reflections, and then also then move on to consider some closing thoughts. One of my great cartoon characters is Snoopy. Hence and this actually is called the Joy of Snoopy, this particular cartoon by Schultz. And looking at two particular elements here. So far as a standard definition of joy, there is such a thing. Attention, especially ecstatic, exultant happiness, or such feeling, as from the online dictionary. But then looking at it in a more biblical sense, I found this rather good definition, particular site called Just Disciple. The biblical definition of joy says that joy is a feeling of good pleasure and happiness, but is dependent upon who Jesus is rather than on who we are or what's happening around us. Joy comes from the Holy Spirit abiding in God's presence and from hope from his word. And I've underlined some specific elements there: Holy Spirit and abiding in God's presence. And hopefully, as we go forward, that will become more clear. Then I'm going to look at her life. Evelyn Underhill. I studied her as part of my master's dissertation for a course I've just finished. She was born in Wolverhampton in 1875, only child. She was home educated. Her father admitted in the unpublished biography of a life written by Lucy Menzies that he actually didn't want children. So she found herself in a somewhat, I would suggest, slightly lonely experience. She had a series of mystical experiences from a young age, attended boarding school, initially agnostic, actually atheist, but experienced the presence of God. She became increasingly aware of two worlds, this aspect of dualism, became theocentric. And then a rather strange period in her life took place that had a profound experience on it. It's an area that I want to do some further research because I'm not sure we will ever get to the bottom of this. But she basically joined an organization called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is an occult group in Edwardian England. She was there between 1903 and 1906. Now, having had some degree of involvement in the spiritualist movement as well, and also got an understanding of what was taking place, this group was actually operating on an illegal basis because it was actually contrary to the 1735 Witchcraft Act, which didn't become basically, what's the word? Thank you, Imperial, thank you, by governments in 1950 after the Helen Duncan case joined the war in the 1940s. She married Herbert Moore in 1907, and 1907 was a particular important year for her. After various experiences where she developed a love and joy for visiting Tuscany, and the sacred sites in Tuscany, Siena, Florence, and so on, and also attending a retreat with a convent, St. Franciscan convent, north of Southampton. She almost became a Roman Catholic. But two things conspired against her. One, Pope Pius X issued his decree against modernists in 1907, which kind of nailed it on that front because she considered herself a modernist. And two, her husband, Herbert, basically said he did not want a third person in the marriage. He was an Anglican and couldn't cope with the aspect of Evelyn going to confessional on a periodic basis. So she stepped back from that. But things were taking place. She had a first major experience in around 1902, which we'll touch upon in a minute, but she also wrote 3 novels, which appear as novels, but when you look at them alongside her life, actually are semi-autobiographical in nature. In 1911, she published her major work, Mysticism, which is probably one of the most famous works that she's famous for. It's been in print ever since through the various editions. In 1920, the Baron Frederick von Hugel himself, a mystic who published his own work, The Mystical Experience of Religion in 1908. And she was under his directorship, spiritual directorship, for a number of years until he died in 1925. Her public commitment to becoming an Anglican took place only in 1921, by which her study and fame around mysticism in general grew. She participated with Manchester College in Oxford, became a fellow at King's College London in 1927, and was probably considered as one of the most prominent Anglo-Catholic mystics of the 20th century. I gave a presentation at the spring conference. Some of you may remember me giving it on the Dark Night of the Soul. And this presentation, really, in a sense, is almost a continuation on from where I left off. The last slide that I showed as an afterthought in the spring was this, and I think it is a profound statement by Evelyn later in her life, where things had really come together, and she was basically trying to distill what it is all about for us as human beings. Here we are, little half animal, half spiritual creatures, mysteriously urged from within and enticed from without to commune with spiritual reality, with a capital R. She uses this term for absolute, she uses this term for the absolute and for God. If and when we surrender to this craving and this attraction, we enter thereby, though at first dimly, a completely new life full of variety and new joy. Just bear that in mind as we go forward and we start to look at some of the later slides, as we look at this element around Evelyn and her work. By the way, if anybody's looking for references after this presentation, I'm more than happy to give those to you. So her first experience took place somewhere around 1902. And she wrote about it in a letter to a friend sometime after. The first thing I found out was an exalted and indescribable beauty in the most squalid of places. I still remember walking down Notting Hill Main Road and observing the landscape, which was extremely sordid, with joy and astonishment. Even the movements of the traffic had something universally sublime about it. Of course, that does not last, but the after flavor of it does, and every now and again one catches it again. When one does catch it, it is so real that to look upon it as to be wrong to the unthinkable absurdity. At the same time, one sees the world in those moments so completely as energized by the invisible. There is no temptation to rest in the mere enjoyment of the invisible. This experience, as exhibited by her later writings and work, had a strong influence upon her. So on the back of this experience, and some time later, she actually wrote quite a bit of poetry, and this experience that she had comes up again in a poem entitled Uxbridge Road. I take the end of the first verse and the opening of the second verse as the main part reflecting this. To smear the little space between the city and the stone, the torments of that seething tide who is there with what we can see. There is one who walks with starry feet the western road by me. He is the drove of the soul. He leads his flock of men, all wistful on that weary track, and brings them back again. So we can start to see how the impact of what had happened back in 1902 started to really develop with her. And then later, when she's actually writing mysticism, Underhill connects mystical consciousness to pure love. She writes, a harmony is thus set up between the mystic and life in all forms. Undistracted by appearance, he sees, feels, and knows it is one piercing act of loving comprehension. The heart outstrips the clumsy senses and sees, perhaps for the instance, perhaps for long periods of bliss, an undistorted and more veritable world. All things are perceived in the light of charity, and hence Under's aspect of beauty. For beauty is simply reality in the eyes of love. For such reverent, joyous sights, the meanest accidents in life are radiant. And again, the London streets are paths of loveliness. The very omnibuses look like coloured archangels, their laps filled full of little trustful souls. This paragraph, which she calls the experience again, and what it means to her, is actually typical of the style of English that she uses for the whole of the Book of Mysticism. It is not an easy read for the modern reader. I will tell you that because it took me a few goes to actually get into the heart of it. She uses an Edwardian romantic style, and she's received criticism for this, but I believe she did it on purpose. Not so much because of her upbringing, but she's actually trying to describe something beyond the words. It is like good poetry, true poetry. And also music, and forgive me if I get this quote wrong, I think it was Chopin who said the music is the silence that exists between the notes. In a sense, it's the same thing with the written word with what she's trying to describe here. So we can see how this event that took place around 1902 took root and developed within her over this period of time, 6 to 7 years between the events and actually writing her treatise, Mysticism. I'm now going to go on and look at some famous historical mystics. Some of them, I'm sure you're well aware of, and others you may not be. The first is the mystical experience of St. Thomas Aquinas. Famous theologian, a writer of many scripts during the 13th century. He, during the December of the 6th in 1273, Thomas Aquinas had a profound mystical experience whilst participating in a Michaelmas service. He died shortly after this experience, never writing again on the 7th of March, some 3 months later. And what actually he said was that he felt that compared to the heavenly beauty of what he had seen, everything he'd ever written was as worthless as straw, because he felt he could not properly describe what he'd felt, what he'd seen, and the depth of the emotion that he went to. Next, I'd like to call upon another mystic, not particularly well known, but that is St. Catherine of Genoa. She was married to a marriage that she was forced into, suffered from bouts of depression, and then had her own mystical experience. In this state of mystical consciousness, the soul is in such peace and tranquility that it seems to her that both soul and body are immersed in a sea of profoundest peace, for which she would not issue anything that could happen in this life. She remains immovable, imperturbable, neither her humanity nor her spirit feels anything except the sweetest peace of which she is so full, that if her flesh, her bones, her nerves were pressed together, nothing would issue from them but peace, and all day long she sings softly to herself for joy. She spent the rest of her life, after this life-changing experience, committing herself to helping the sick and the poor of Genoa's slums and serving the less fortunate for the remainder of her life. I'll then go slightly left of field now and talk about the mystical experience of St. Rabbi of Basra. She was born in 717, died in 717, died 801. Is an Arab Muslim saint and one of the most celebrated Sufi mystics. Evelyn Underhill had a great respect for the Sufi mystics and spent a lot of time researching them. She is regarded as the first person who set forth the doctrine of divine love. Through her experience of divine love, mystical consciousness, and the blotting out of her individual sense of self. Again, this is another important element coming up in what I would call this classically strong, deep religious mystical experiences. She, in her poem, she writes, "In love, nothing exists between heart and heart. Speech is born out of longing, true description from the real taste. The one who tastes knows, the one who explains lies. How can you describe the true form of something in whose presence you are blotted out, and whose being you still exist, and who lives as a sign for your journey?" It's possibly one of the most powerful statements that I've read about this aspect of the self, the ego, the me just disappearing at the height of the experience of this degree, at this point of divine union. Now, moving on to something on a sort of contemporary basis of the last 50 years, there are 4 mystics that I'm going to refer to here, and also an organization called Aimer. And I have to say here, I feel a bit of a turncoat after Marianne's presentation last night, because this organization is based in the United States. There's something quite similar to the Hardy Trust. It's the Institute for Mystical Experience Research and Education. It's based in New York State, and it is a non-for-profit organization. And it's worthwhile just taking a look at what they're trying to set out to do. They are non-denominational, cross-cultural, whatever background you're from or belief experience you have, basically, they would like to hear from you. So they use terms of cosmic experience, mystical experience, enlightenment experience, oneness experience, near-death experience, etc. And you can see the rest up there. But it's an interesting introduction that they write here, where they say, for the last 3,000 years, people from every region of the world have experienced something extraordinary and transformational, the mystical experience. During the mystical experience, there exists a simple unity of pure consciousness and non-duality of observer and observed. In addition to oneness, the defining features of mystical experience include feelings of sacredness, peace, and bliss, a sense of transcending time and space, an intuitive conviction that the experience is a source of object truth about reality. And here they've actually referenced the work by W.T. Stace in his work, Mysticism and Philosophy. They go on. The effects of mystical experience are of enormous value to both the experiences and humanity. On a personal level, mystical experience leads to a sudden and lasting positive change in the experience's characters and values. Here they're quoting the work by Bruce Grierson entitled The Shift at the Frontiers of Consciousness. And Bruce Grierson is known to members of the fellowship because he wrote the book after, which was published last year, all about near-death experience. On a global basis, mystical experience lie near the foundation of religions generally, and thus even civilization itself. Indeed, it is the mystical roots of consciousness experience, real a deep human identity transcending all national, racial, personal, and theological differences. It is therefore vital to further gather understanding of the important transformation experiences. And this is where quoting Kelly. It's well worth a sight if you go on to Google, whichever search engine you use, and just type in the initials IMERE, you will find them. They are very interested in gathering people's experiences. If you've had one, you've actually taken into a questionnaire that's about 70 odd questions long, which is very interesting because it starts to explore various facets and elements of each of these experiences. So I've used Aimer quite a bit for pulling together some of this key information over the next few slides. So I'd like to now just mention some of them. And the key one here, Edgar Mitchell, who is an astronaut on Apollo 14, and his experience of union with the universe. So Mitchell, I'm getting lost here. PhD, he was a naval officer, test pilot, aeronautical engineer, and was one of the main astronauts on Apollo 14 in 1971. Being a young boy at the time, I followed all the missions, sort of characteristics. Mystical described his mystical experience, which occurred on his way back to Earth after 9 hours on the moon's surface, as follows. I saw the Earth, the sun, and the moon, and 360-degree panorama of the heavens. The magnificence of all of this was to trigger a visioning me. In ancient Sanskrit, it's called samandhi. It means to see things with your senses the way they are. You experience them viscerally, internally, as a unity with oneness accompanied by ecstasy. And it had a profound experience on him. He left NASA a few years later to find the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and it fundamentally changed much of his life. And I just read from this in his own words. I realized that the story of ourselves as told by science or our cosmology, our religion, was completely and likely flawed. I recognized that the Newtonian idea of separate, independent, discrete things in the universe wasn't a fully accurate description. We need a new story of who we are and what we are capable of becoming. I'd like now to touch upon a very famous poet, writer, playwright, that of W.H. Auden. He was a British-American poet, playwright, critic, librist, considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. The reason why I'm bringing it up is talking about this aspect of union with fellow human beings. He, in 1948, won the Pulitzer Prize for his writing on the Age of Anxiety, a long poem about mankind's quest to find meaning and identity in a changing and industrialized world. His mystical experience was this, that one fine summer night in June 1933, I was sitting on a lawn after dinner with 3 colleagues, 2 women and 1 man. We liked each other well enough, but we were certainly not intimate friends, nor had any sexual interest in one another. I felt myself invaded by a power through which, although I consented to, it was irresistibly and certainly not mine. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly, because thanks to the power, I was doing it, what it meant to be one's neighbor as one, to love one's neighbor as oneself. Auden believes such an experience to be ineffable, writing, I do not think mystical experience can be verbalized. When the ego disappears, so does the power of language. And this is kind of similar to what the Sufi saints, Basri said in the earlier slide. Moving on to a slightly more modern basis, being with God, the mystical experience of Nancy Clark, who was a founder and facilitator in Columbus, Ohio, a branch of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And what had actually happened was, she'd had a dream a few days earlier of a close friend of hers dying, only to find out the following day that she had passed, her friend had passed, and she was called to give a eulogy at the service for her friend. I was addressing the audience with the eulogy and spoke perhaps 3 sentences when all of a sudden I became aware of a brilliant white light coming from the left rear of the chapel at the ceiling. I did not see the light with my eyes, but rather with some inexplicable source. It was more of an inner awareness. Upon seeing this light, there was an immediate recognition on my own part that it was God. I felt I was in the presence of my Creator, a very exhilarating spiritual feeling. I can't explain how I knew or how I recognized God's presence. The best I can do is to say that there was a transference of knowledge placed directly into the consciousness. In a few words, I was being fed information I was supposed to receive. The light completely surrounded me. I felt as if I had been merged completely with the light and belonged to it. I felt a greater sense of reality. And this true state, I felt as if I was at home, which again is another element that's repeated through mystical experiences of many mystics, this sense of returning to some form of long forgotten home. Now coming somewhat more up to date, and I want to talk about the mystical experience of Mike Zasturic, which I'll call rebellion and union. He is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Athabasca, I think that's the way you pronounce it, in Alberta, Canada. He was born into a strict Catholic family and received a Catholic education upbringing. He studied psychology and sociology and became a Marxist atheist. Such was the impact of his strict Catholic upbringing. Forgive me for saying that, but that's actually how he describes it in his paper, which I'll just touch on in a moment. One night, experienced the presence of God whilst watching a film and spent the night in a furious argumentative conversation with him. I was surprised when I read this paper that they actually allowed it to be published, especially with some of the English that he uses, which is a bit Anglo-Saxon in character. So I'm going to give you a few edited highlights because I don't want to upset anybody. It's actually been published in the Journal of Consciousness, Exploration and Research, and was published in December 2016. His experience dates from about 2006. I'll just read out a few comments from here. I sat down to watch the movie, and within a few minutes, normal reality collapsed. I was confronted with none other than the almighty patriarch of my Catholic indoctrination. One moment I was sitting watching the movie, the next I was in the streaming consciousness of having a full-blown conversation with God in my mind. It was not a pleasant conversation. Thought gushed. You might expect that I met God and experienced wonder, glory, or joy. I did not. When I met God, I experienced pure terror. In fact, I felt like the small child who being caught by an act of disobedience by an alcoholic father. Even though I had done nothing more than shoot a bird with a pellet gun as a small child, which immediately caused me to break down and cry with what I committed. I had felt that God had arrived to judge me and cast me into the fiery pits of hell. I felt unworthy of God's love. He goes on. I had worthless, useless, insignificant, inconsequential, dirty, sinful, cosmic garbage, powerless, subjugated, defeated, all the adjectives I could use my feelings during this brief but hyper-toxic monologue with a very Catholic God. It was certainly a surprise, I thought, that when God left behind and converted myself to atheism, for all what had taken place. So what did I do? I will miss out the next bit because it's extremely explicit. All I could do was to sit and wait for a lightning bolt from God's wrath to shatter me into the cosmic pieces of dirt that I was. This was the depth of the feeling that he was actually sensing in them. He basically was extremely fearful and emotional that night. The anger came on and on. He felt like he was fighting for his life at one point. Then, exhausted by the outburst, I sat back and waited for my insolence to sink in. I waited for God's wrath to materialize. I waited, in short, for the lightning bolt to strike me down. But the lightning bolt never came. I was expecting, in the rest of the watch of the movie, I remained unaware of anything untoward had occurred so far as his wife was concerned. And traumatized, I went up to bed. In those words, he says, I was mildly surprised to wake up the next morning. He goes on, he basically vented all of his fury, whatever had taken place in his youth, of his very strict Catholic upbringing, with all, unfortunately, some of the negatives that it basically came to. And then for 2 days, nothing happened. And then basically, the morning of the third day, everything changed. He went and he sat down at his computer, and he suddenly felt God was within, and he felt an uncontrollable urge to write. And what he basically said, the very first thing that came spewing from my brain was a story of creation in the form of an epic poem. The story replaced the canonical creation mythology of good and evil with a story of true unity, love, and purpose. And he found, when he wrote this paper in 2016, that he basically developed this skill, gift, sense of union, that every day that he sat down at his PC for 4 or 5 hours, he would just write. He's published novels, poems about mysticism, spirituality, and consciousness, and a number of serious academic papers as well. Hence the reason, and you'll understand why, I entitled this particular section called Rebellion and Union. Next, I'd just like to touch upon now and go back to the work of Robert Crookall, who was a member of this fellowship in '69. And in his work, The Interpretation of Cosmic and Mystical Experiences, he writes about 10 different forms of oneness, which is a term that he coined for unity, with inanimate objects all the way through to God. But finally comes the point of stating that the absolute certainty joy characterizes the experience. And he calls upon a number of writers here. Certainly joy is a constant feature of mystical experience. Pascal indeed described absolute certainty beyond reason. Dr. Hatfield used the words almost identical to those of Pascal. It was absolutely certainly, I knew I was utterly safe. I could no longer doubt he was there than I was. And is all taken from his book, page 116. He goes on and just finishes with this, and he uses a quote from Romans 8:39, which is, I am convinced there is nothing to fear in life or death. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord. So I'd just like to move on to some reflections now. Deep, strong emotions, primarily joy at the heart of the mystical experience. Mystical experiences have very close similarities to that of near-death experiences. And it's interesting, I was speaking to some of my colleagues last night, with the advancements in medical science, near-death experiences becoming more and more common. So in a sense, the mystical experience through near-death experience is becoming more and more commonplace amongst the population. These experiences can be life-changing and transformational. We know that, we see it, we've touched upon elements of this as we've gone through various slides, and also from, I'm sure, from your own studies and reading. They can give the recipients a complete new view of life, existence, reality, and of God. And one of the key aspects is unity at oneness is a fundamental facet of these experiences, being drawn out of ourselves and experience that degree of unity with other things, with other people, with God, with creation. But there is a however. They can also lead to periods of isolation, the loss of recipient understanding of self. They can also lead to periods of what I would call homesickness and a separation from others. Going back to Evelyn, it is fascinating that the spiritual director that she was closest to and she felt most at home with was the Baron Frederick von Hugel, who himself had had mystical experiences. And she talks about her frailties, her weaknesses as a human being, suffering with petty jealousies, possessiveness, the frailties of human life, human condition. But she also talks about these periods of spiritual isolation and loneliness. And von Hugel said he did too, ever since he'd had his own experiences. And he referred to them as a tummy ache of the soul, which I always thought was a rather lovely term for it, actually. And actually, he gave her very practical advice. He said, look, when you get to these periods like this, just stop all your following your acts of faith for a period of time. Go and dig the garden, follow your hobbies, be involved in life here. And I think this is the whole aspect of balance between the two and making sure that there is balance in your life. And it's something, again, that I personally know I've had bouts of having to deal with this myself, and I understand it. But there's also this aspect of a sense of separation from others, and this is something I believe that many of the mystics of the past had to cope with. And it's rather interesting, this, because Evelyn writes of this in the end of possibly her most contentious chapter in mysticism, which is called Mysticism and Magic. It's the one that all her biographers have habits of just skirting over because they really don't want to get thoughts in that. The heart of that, by the way, is the fact that she believed in the purity of the sacred ceremony to help invoke and hold the conversation, union with God and the divine. Anyway, just reading back on what she wrote. In spite of the persistent evidence to the contrary, there will always be an inner and outer church. The inner church of the mystics who know, the outer church is operating beneficially, it is true, roughly speaking, only knows about. The New Testament is not without its reminders that this is bound to be the case, and she goes on to give a couple of references. One, Matthew 8:11, I say unto you, many will come from the east and west. It's a rather interesting reference to use. And then also Corinthians 1, chapter 2, verse 16, howbeit we speak of wisdom amongst them that are perfect, yet not the wisdom of this world, nor the princes of this world that come to naught. The interesting thing about this is this was published in her first edition, Mysticism, which was in 1911. However, come the 12th edition in 1930, pardon me, this whole section had been removed. She'd become a leading Anglican, and probably it's possible she was starting to try and mollify her stance because this degree of separateness that she felt. But the history of theology, I would argue, both in a scholarly and mystical perspective, have elements in this. There's a rather lovely book written by Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan monk in California, called The Naked Now. Subtitle, Learning to See How Mystics See. And he makes this rather lovely comment that mystics of the past were tolerated by the Orthodox Church or held as heretics, often disappeared into the background and forgotten about, only for them to be raised again a couple of centuries later and to be turned into saints. An interesting thought. So just in my closing thoughts, if you've had a mystical experience, then it may well be one of the most important and joyous experiences of your life. From what I've read and experienced myself, cherish it. Give yourself time to reflect upon it. You may find, and I've found this to be the case, and I found it with others that I've read about, that it deepens in meaning and importance to you as time passes. Sometimes these experiences are not meant for the very moment that they're given, but for what unfolds in the years and decades to come. Read and explore, study mystics of the past and the present. But just remember this, most importantly of all, you're not alone. Many others have had such similar experiences. With that, I'd just like to finish. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody got any questions for Andrew? No, gentlemen.
Just one moment, sorry, to put a microphone.
So it's going to have to be.
I'd like to see that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, fine. I'll shout. If necessary.
The power light question. Oh, can't run it for the. Is that working? Yeah, lovely. Sorry.
Just curious to know, do we happen to know what film Mike Sosterik was watching when?
Oh, yeah.
The Abyss.
Thank you.
They miss. Very clever CGI.
Thank you. I was wondering what you thought. There's a continuous tension in these studies between, is our consciousness universal and self-obliterating, or is our experience self-affirming? So you look at those in the Far Eastern religions, and it's a case of obliteration of the self, and therefore obliteration of my neighbor as well. Whereas in the Christian, in the church, it's an affirmation of myself and an affirmation of my neighbor. And I think this is brought out by Stace and Parman,
Yes.
and other people like that, and Katz and consciousness.
Yes.
The modern literature, because it tends not to be produced by Christians,
Yes.
tends to work towards one, whereas traditionally those produced by Christians, or I suppose, so I'm thinking with Islam and Judaism, there isn't a mediating force like Christ, a person like Christ. So what difference does Christ make in our affirmation of self or our destruction of self? Because in the Christian tradition, when it hasn't been an obliteration of self, people get burnt for that, like Marguerite Porete, you know. They but to read her now from Black Raven Press or somebody should be fine. So that's what did it affirmation of self or destruction of self, and is that dependent on cultural specificity of East or West?
Best of luck with that one.
I'm not saying there's an answer.
No.
It's just an observation.
Well, my flippant remark is, I guess we're all going to find out, aren't we? For me, I think this is going to sound like a political answer.
Go for it.
For a major part, is about the I. However, once you've felt that true union with God, it doesn't matter. Because that actually is the drive. I believe that many mystics, past and present, when they've had these experiences, it is the most powerful experience of their lives. It is like, if you want to turn it in drugs, it is the most powerful drug you'll ever take. And once experienced it, you just want to get back to it. I keep on being drawn to the idea of, I don't know where this came from, probably from above somewhere, of the sort of the parallel of the wild salmon at sea on the other side of the world, with this innate drive to get back to the very spawning bred in the ever tributary of the very river it was born, and it spends its whole life, its existence, on a journey to get back to that place. I think many mystics, certainly the ones that I've studied and read and got further understanding of, I mean, the whole of the final chapter of Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism, is all about living in unity. And that unity driving to that, basically, the ultimate union with God. So I think there's a bit of both, and I cannot actually answer directly your question, because I think there's an aspect about our ongoing development as spiritual beings.
You see that in Anglo development.
Yes.
From being like a sort of Gnostic,
Yes.
in a sense, that we have an inner church of the pure.
Yes.
A development, probably in the von Hugel, from being a sort of Gnostic, we have a special knowledge of the inner church and the other people just there
Yes.
doing a nice thing, to moving towards it's for all of us. And I think that I did some work on the different introduction prefaces of
Yes.
work, and it's a fascinating,
Yes, it
you can
is.
see the influences
Yeah.
on her. And I think she's becoming more and more consciously a member of the body of Christ in a living way for everybody.
Yes.
It
It was a long battle for, I mean, it took her 20 years to take her on that journey.
Yes, thank you for the question. It really made me think, which is quite a hard thing to do, actually. And what occurred to me was that we're fortunate as Christians, if we're Christians, that we have the person of Christ that reflects that God came to humanity as a personality, an individual, which rather highlights God's acceptance of us as individuals. So individuality does remain quite important right up to quite a high level, although I believe ultimately we do become one with God. I think that's enough for me.
I'll go to Christine and I'll come back to the chair. Just one moment, sorry, Christine, could you take the microphone?
I think the top's come off. Right, thank you. I think my question's a little bit connected with that question, really sure. Because I was reading about Merton and his sort of desert experience. He said when you connect with God, then you connect with the rest of humanity in that way. And then there is that collective consciousness in those who don't believe in a God, that when they have mystic experience, they are all connected with each other. And then maybe if you see it in that way, then God might be constructed from that, you know, in a sort of constructivist view. And then there's that failed priest, Carl Rogers, who I am still struggling with, who decided to take, you know, the Christian principles, debunk the rest of it and turn it into sort of humanistic psychology for healing. But towards just before, well, in his last book before he died, he talked about in the therapy room, when you connect with the other for healing, that you are connected spirit, as though, he didn't use the word spiritually, you're connected with something greater than oneself above. And that was as close as he could come to coming back to saying there is a spiritual entity that when we connect with each other, it brings healing. And therefore you could just about construct there is God from that. And I take it that because of the Trinity, the family and the flow and the Trinity flowing to us, we are all joined up as one. And so when we, in our humanity, love man and show the love of God, like in a behavioral way, and connect with each other, we have to be connected up to God, because that is the flow. What's your view on that?
Well, as you were speaking, Christine, and forgive me, even though I've studied a contemporary degree in theology at St Andrews, probably going to get this quote completely wrong, but I'm just trying to remember the piece of scripture where Christ said, where more than two of you come together, I am with you. And I think it's a fundamental truth. Having practiced spiritual healing myself, and when you do get to what I would call the zone, you know that there's others, something else with you when that is taking place. Undoubtedly, yes.
I wonder whether you would be ready to tell us about one of your own spiritual or extraordinary experiences.
No, I'm happy to. That's not true. I will do. And I'll because I actually wrote about this in the WhatsApp chat a month or two ago. So in a sense, I've already gone public with it, so to speak. But I just say this, it is probably the most intimate, important reflection of my life that I'm about to share with you. And in attempting to share that, I will only give an out of focus, monochrome, fuzzy, muddy picture of what actually took place. Okay. It was about 20 years ago. I'd been out for a walk. I was walking back from our local forest. It's a place I normally go to for contemplation and meditation anyway, usually walking. It's a beautiful forest. It's fortunate. It's only about a quarter of a mile away from our home in our village of Carnet. And as I was walking back, thinking about nothing in particular, actually, just enjoying the day, a number of things happened extraordinarily quickly. First time stopped. My consciousness expanded to the point where the only way I could describe is I could think at the speed of light. The muddiness and the slowness and grogginess of the human brain, whatever, has gone. I felt an instant connection with everything around me. The tree I was standing beside, I was the tree was me, I was the ground was me. Everything I passed my attention to, I felt a degree of union with. And then something particularly special happened because, and all of this, what sequence it happened in, I can't explain, but it was there. I saw the grand design of creation. I understood why the tree was there. I understood why I was here. I understood why everything that was around me was there. It was a sense of almost seeing the divine equation of creation laid out in front of me. I realized I could ask any question and get an instantaneous answer. Any question. But then I realized I had no questions to ask. There was no need to. Well, I might get a bit emotional. And then he, she, it was present with me. And this is the bit I kind of get lost in it, because all I can describe it is the purest sense of love I have ever felt. No fear, no doubt. I actually felt I had returned to a long forgotten home, where I truly came from. It brought me to my knees. I was fantastically joyous. The instance very, very gently evaporated. I felt I was walking on air. I couldn't speak to anybody about it for at least 10 years. But it was a life-affirming event of my own existence, my own being. And I came away from it because somebody asked me, well, how did you change? In fact, I think Evelyn asked me that question. I found a source of strength within me I never knew that I had, but had always been there. It gave me a sense of, this is going to sound arrogant, almost confidence. It didn't matter what happened, I would be okay. It didn't happen, I knew everybody would be okay. And that led to years and years of self-reflection. I've been on the journey ever since. Last year, when my mother died, I was with her for the last 3 months of her life. It was during COVID. I nursed her, gave her morphine every day during the final days of her life. I was with her when she passed. It was a very, very special experience. It was almost like something out of spiritual symmetry. I helped her pass into the new world in the very room that I was conceived, but I had my very earliest thoughts of this life. 12 hours later, my father was with me, and I felt the fantastic joy that he had, that he was getting his partner, his lover, back to his life. And another 24 hours after that, I felt my mother wake up in the new world to a sense of shock, joy, excitement, and all I could say to her was, "Mum, I told you so." But on the back of that, and that's a bit where the isolation that it came from. I was emotionally, spiritually, physically exhausted by what had taken place. I remember one night I was in the house by myself, and I was in deep reflection, and I cried out. I said, "When's it going to be my turn? Who's going to be there to meet me?" Actually, at one point I said, "How do you know I want to go home now?" I need to be realized that no, you've got things to do. Get on with it. Yeah. But yeah. Very much so.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Anybody else? got anything? Maria?
I don't want to ask anything. I just want to thank you, because I get asked this, and I tell of certain experiences, because I too have experiences I can't share.
No.
And thank you.
Thank you. Is the bar open?
Stiff whiskers for Speakers Day. I'll go to Chris and I'll come to Matt.
Yeah, thanks. Also want to echo Marianne's thank you, because it's hard talking about things that are so intimate and personal and deep. So thank you for that. Very valuable for us. Thank you. I was interested thinking about what Marianne was saying about C.S. Lewis last night on the bus, and then on the way to the zoo, and then there you walking through the woods, and you said it again. I wasn't really thinking about anything in particular. That there so often seems to be something, even for those who are seeking, there seems to be something kind of unbidden about the moment that these things come. That we almost as though we have to be distracted and elsewhere
Absolutely.
to be open to it. And I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on that.
You know, I think there's an aspect of this, and it's going to sound counterintuitive. The harder you look for something, the less likely you are to find it. So there's almost an aspect about what I would just call about being patient, but also being aware and awake as to when the time comes. It's funny, as you were talking, I was reminded of another lovely analogy I sometimes use. You know, I forget which of Shakespeare's plays he writes, all the world the stage and we are players upon it. It's almost like that aspect, the actor realizes that he's the actor, and then suddenly the director says, over here. I think when it comes out of the blue, there's an absolute purity about it, as if to say, I'm here. And that is actually probably one of the most beautiful aspects about it. I mean, just to affirm my own Christian faith, that experience led me to go and explore many things, one of which was Ignatian contemplation and meditation, which I find particularly powerful, and I've done a number of times. And possibly the most powerful experience was when I think everybody's aware of Ignatian meditation. You know the scene so well, you put yourself right in it, you sense it, you see it, you feel it, of the biblical scene that's being talked about. And it was all about the healing of the leper, where they get the hole in the top of the building, the crowd is full, the Pharisees in the corner. Well, I just put myself in the middle of the audience watching all of this. And right at the end of the meditation, well, right at the end of what I was sensing, I should say, everything disappeared until Christ was on one side of the room and I was on the other. And he just simply walked over to me and said, Andrew, come walk with me. And I've been walking ever since. Yeah.
The sense of being incapable of articulating one's mystical experience just reminds me of what Paul said about the man, in inverted commas, that he knew that was caught up to third heaven, and he was just didn't know if he was in the body or not, hadn't got a clue, but it just happened. And he said, you know, just trying to articulate it, he couldn't. He just said, you know, I'm not permitted to speak of it. I just can't describe it. And we kind of have this idea that Paul was going through a near-death experience. That's one of the things, but having done a bit of research, I don't think he was. I think he was just having a mystical experience. And throughout the scriptures, there are mind-blowing accounts of encountering the numinous, whether it is just the shining of the burning bush, through to Ezekiel's out-of-body experiences into the other realm. And it just encourages me that when we hear these things, they aren't just new things. They've been going on for thousands and thousands of years. They're not this woo-woo, new agey type thing at all. They're actually embedded within the very fabric of the text of the scriptures. So we shouldn't be frightened of this stuff.
No.
at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was just thinking a lot of this has been very Christian focused, but I wonder if Muhammad's night journey wasn't a similar mystical experience reinterpreted and put into a different picture.
Yes. Actually, if we look at many of the mystics from the other great faiths of the world, and we lay them side by side, there is almost a common golden link between all of them. Yeah.
You mentioned the Sufi mystic
Yes.
maybe long ago. I don't doubt that all religions have this mystical side, which is perfectly valid and relates perfectly well to God, whichever religion you're following. Personally.
Thank you. Any more? If we do have any more questions, please do put them in the box, and I'm sure Andrew will be happy to attempt to answer them on our session tomorrow. But it just remains to me, can we say thank you once again to Andrew for what he's brought to us this morning? Thank you.